Kunja Bihari. Gopi Janabalabha Giri Bharadahari. Jaya Gopi Janabalabha Giri Bharadahari. Yasoda Nandana Braja Janaranjana. Yasoda Nandana Braja Janaranjana. Yamuna Tira Bana Shari. Yamuna Tira Bana Shari. Jai Radha Madhava Kunja Bihari. Hare Krishna, Hare Krishna, Krishna Krishna, Hare Hare, Hare Rama, Hare Rama, Rama Rama, Hare Hare. Hare Krishna, Hare Krishna, Krishna Krishna, Hare Hare, Hare Rama, Hare Rama, Rama Rama, Hare Hare. Hare Krishna, Krishna Krishna, Hare Hare, Hare Rama, Hare Rama, Rama Rama, Hare Hare. Hare Krishna, Krishna Krishna, Hare Hare, Hare Ram, Rama Rama, Hare Hare. Hare Krishna, Krishna Krishna, Hare Hare, Hare Ram, Rama Rama, Hare Hare. Hare Krishna, Krishna Krishna, Hare Hare, Hare Ram, Rama Rama, Hare Hare. Jaya Prabhupada, 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 Prabhupada, Jaya Prabhupada. Jayom Vishnupad Paramhamsa Paramahansa To Tarasata Shri Srimad His Divine Grace A.C. Bhaktivedanta Swami Prabhupada Ki Ananta Koti Vaishnavrinda Ki Granthad Srimad Bhagavad Gita Ki Samveda Bhaktivinoda Ki Gaur Premanandi. All glory is to assembled devotees. All glory is to assembled devotees. All glory is to assembled devotees. All glory is to Sri Sri Guru and Sri Gauranga. Om Namo Bhagavate Vasudevaya. 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 Om Namo Om Ajnanatimirandasya Ghananjana Shalakaya Chakshuranmilitam Yena Tasmai Shri Gurave Namaha Shri Chaitanya Manobishtam Shtapitam Yena Bhutale Swayam Rupa Kadamayam Didati Swapadantikam Vandeham Shri Guru Shri Yuta Padakamalam Shri Gurun Vaishnavam Cha Shri Rupam Sagrajatam Sahagana Raghunatam Vitam Tam Sajivam Sadvaitam Savadhunam Parijana Sahitam Krishna Chaitanya Devam Shri Radha Krishna Padam Sahagana Lalita Shri Vishakanvitam Cha Hey Krishna Karuna Sindho Dinabandho Jagatpate Gopesha Gopika Kanta Radha Kanta Namostute Dhapta Kanchana Gaurangi Radhe Vrindavan Eshvari Vrishabhanu Sute Devi Pranamami Hari Priye Vanchakalpa Tarubhyascha Kripa Sindhubhya Evacha Patitanam Bhavan Ebhyo Vaishnavebhyo Namo Namaha Shri Krishna Chaitanya Prabhu Nityananda Shri Advaita Gadadhara Shri Vasadi Gaur Bhaktavinda Hare Krishna 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 Hare 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 Rama 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 Hare 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 Krishna 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 Hare 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 Rama 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 Hare Hare. So I'm told that we are on chapter 9, text 17. Itahamasya jagato Pitahamasya jagato Mata dhata pitamaha Mata dhata pitamaha Vedyam pavitram onkara Vedyam pavitram omkara Riksama Yajur Evacham. Riksama Yajur Evacham. Pitahamasya Jagato. Mata Dhata Pitamaha. Vedyam Pavitram Omkara. Rikshama Yajur Evacha. Do people responsibly read, or we just go on? Anyone would like to try it?
Pitahamasya Jagato.
Pitahamasya Jagato.
Matadata Pitamaha.
Matadhata Pitamaha. Vedyam Bhavitram Omkara. Yajur Evacha.
Pitaham Asya Jagato.
Pitaham Asya Jagato.
Mata Data Pitamaha.
Matadhata Pitamaha.
Vedyam Pavitram Omkara.
Vedyam Pavitram Omkara.
Rikshama Yajur Evacha.
Riksama Yajur Evacha.
Pitama Asya Jagato.
Pitam Asya Jagato.
Mata Data Pitamaha.
Mata Dhata Pitamaha.
Vedyam Pavitram Omkara.
Vedyam Pavitram Omkara.
Sama Yajur Evacha.
Riksama Yajur Evacha. Ladies, anyone? Pitahamasya Jagato. Mata Dhata Pitamaha. Vedyam Pavitram Omkara. Riksama Yajur Evacha.
Pitahamasya Jagato.
Pitahamasya Jagato.
Mata Data Pitamaha.
Mata Dhata Pitamaha.
Vedyam Pavitram Omkara.
Vedyam Pavitram Omkara.
Riksama Yajur Evacha.
Riksama Yajur Evacha. Pitam. Father. Aham. I. Asya. Of this. Jagataha. Universe. Mata. Mother. Dhata. Supporter. Pitamaha. Grandfather. Vedyam. What is to be known. Pavitram. That which purifies. Omkara. The syllable Om. Rik. The Rig Veda. Sama. The Sama Veda. Yajuhu. The Yajur Veda. Eva. Certainly. Cha. And. So the translation reads, I am the father of this universe, the mother, the support, and the grandsire. I am the object of knowledge, the purifier, and the symbol Om. I am the Rik, the Sama, and Yajur Vedas. So I say, and you please repeat, I am the father of this universe. In real existence, we create different relationships with different living entities who are nothing but Krishna's marginal energy. Under the creation of Prakriti, some of them appear as our father, mother, grandfather, creator, etc. But actually, they are parts and parcels of Krishna. As such, these living entities who appear to be our father, mother, etc. are nothing but Krishna. In this verse, the word dhata means creator. Not only are our father and mother parts and parcels of Krishna, but the creator, grandmother, and grandfather, etc., are also Krishna. Actually, any living entity being part and parcel of Krishna is Krishna. All the Vedas, therefore, aim only towards Krishna. Whatever we want to know through the Vedas is but a progressive step towards understanding Krishna. That subject matter which helps us to purify our constitutional position is especially Krishna. Similarly, The living entity, who is inquisitive to understand all the Vedic principles, is also part and parcel of Krishna, and as such is also Krishna. In all Vedic mantras, the word Om, called Pranava, is the transcendental sound vibration and is also Krishna. And because in all the hymns of the four Vedas, the Sama, Yajur, Rik, and Atharva, the Pranava or Omkar is very prominent. It is understood to be Krishna. So this chapter is called the most confidential knowledge. Krishna is explaining to Arjuna the most confidential knowledge, which is essentially knowledge of him, of Krishna. Krishna is explaining Krishna. I like to open this kind of understanding or discussion with a simple question. If the Supreme Lord desires us to go back to the spiritual world, why is knowledge of him confidential? Why is it hidden? What's the answer to that question? Yes.
Does it mean that it has to be revealed to one who is qualified and ready to receive it?
Well, it does, but why would Krishna ask for qualifications and all this kind of thing? Why, if, ultimately he wants us to go back to him, why does he make it so hard to do it? Why is this knowledge hidden?
Because of the Maya?
Yeah, of course, that's the mechanism by which it's hidden. But, yeah.
Krishna is given freedom.
Yeah, right. Yeah, that's getting closer to what I'm aiming at here. Yeah.
We may not be ready to surrender that.
Well, we're not ready for it, but really what I'm looking for here is this basic idea, you all can think about it, that the reason that knowledge is confidential is because that's the way we want it. The material world is not the spiritual world. There's two different places. So if you got confused, you came in the wrong door. Here you're in the material world. The other door was the spiritual world. But to go back through that door, it's going to take a little bit of work. So in the spiritual world, everybody knows Krishna. It's not confidential knowledge there. It's as they say, exoteric knowledge, not esoteric, but exoteric knowledge. Everybody knows about Krishna in this spiritual world. Not only does everybody know about Krishna, but they're constantly thinking about him and doing things for him. That's the way it is in the spiritual world. And that's the way Krishna wants it, and that's the way it is. But if someone wants to compete with Krishna, of course, it's like an ant competing with a elephant or something like that. It's not possible. So the only way it can work is if Krishna removes himself from the picture. And so he removes himself not only by being invisible. We look around in the room, or we look around outside, or we get up in our morning bed and we look around our room there, and we don't see Krishna anywhere. Maybe if we have some philosophical knowledge, we've been to some classes, we understand Krishna in some philosophical way. We don't see Krishna, we don't experience Krishna for the most part. So Krishna is hidden. The material world makes that possible. It makes that possible. Why? Because this is the place for people who want to forget about Krishna. So if Krishna made himself obvious, then how could we forget about him? So Krishna designs a world where he's hidden, not only from sight, but even philosophically hidden. So therefore, this knowledge is removed not by his desire, but really by deference to our desires. So we don't want to know about him, and so he's not there. And we're not likely to run across him, unless somehow or other we have the fortune to bump across devotees, and they kind of say, "Hey, Bubba, check this out." And we go, no, really, check this out. And then somehow or other we check it out, and we realize, oh yeah, I'm wasting my life. I was trying to enjoy in the material world, and I was ignoring God. Now I'm going to try to understand it. But then it's not easy. Because as we were hearing over here, that to understand Krishna, one does have to be qualified. It isn't just that we can hear about Krishna. Somebody can, put the BBC can put something about India and their religions and say, and Krishna is the main deity of the Indian subcontinent, and they worship him, and they see him as a rather rambunctious young prince, etc., etc. And although it says something about Krishna, nothing happens from that kind of knowledge, because that knowledge does not really awaken us to our real relationship with Krishna. It's very superficial knowledge. And unless we are willing not only to learn about Krishna, take some time to learn about it, but then we're ready to make an effort to serve Krishna, to engage in practical activity, then it remains theoretical knowledge. It doesn't ever get beyond that. So this chapter is called Confidential Knowledge, the most confidential knowledge. Prabhupada says, or at least Burijan explains in one of his books, that confidential knowledge means to know that that we're not this body. And then he says that more confidential knowledge means that we have to not only know that we're not the body, but that there is something higher in the material universe that is organizing things. And most confidential knowledge, it takes all the guesswork out of the whole equation. And most confidential knowledge means to understand that that higher thing in the universe is a person. That person is named Krishna. And our relationship with that person is servant. And if we engage in that activity of service, we become happy. We become actually merged in our original condition, and things go on nicely. We could do that for the rest of eternity. That's what most confidential knowledge is. So again, confidential knowledge is just knowledge that we're not the body. More confidential knowledge is knowledge that there's something higher organizing the universe. And then most confidential knowledge is when it all comes out of the clouds. And we understand that that thing that's controlling the universe is not a thing, it's a person, it's Krishna, and that a relationship with him is service. So this is about most confidential knowledge. The first 3 chapters of the first 6 chapters of Bhagavad Gita, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and 6, those chapters are kind of a prelude, and they describe various Vedic systems. And finally, in chapter 6, we learn that the best one is Bhakti Yoga. Then the middle 6 chapters are where Krishna directly talks about Bhakti Yoga. He's not talking about other kinds of yoga or other kinds of paths. He's talking specifically about Bhakti Yoga, and he's specifically explaining himself. In the first 6 chapters, Krishna is a little indirect. He refers to the Supreme as if it's somebody else. And the middle 6 chapters, he directly identifies himself as the Supreme. And then in the last 6 chapters, Krishna begins to cover some of the same territory that he covered in the first 6 chapters, but now he shows how that's directly connected to devotional service. He talks about these various mysterious understandings of Vedic literature, but he connects them directly to devotional service. So this is sometimes called the heart of the Gita, the middle 6 chapters, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, and 12. These are the middle 6 chapters. So the most confidential knowledge, Krishna is describing himself, and he's describing himself directly in first person to Arjuna. And part of that explanation is this section that we're going through today. The first 3 verses of this chapter, verse 1, 2, and 3, they talk about confidential knowledge. Who gets it, who doesn't, why. Then we go from verse 4 to verse 10, and we hear about how Krishna expands the universe, which is also explaining the same idea that everything comes from Krishna, including the whole entire universe. Then from 11 through basically 15, we hear about different grades of people and their understanding. Some of them very foolish, and some of them very, very advanced. So we go from hearing about fools in, verse, 11, and we hear about wise people up in verse 15. And particularly in 15, which I'm going to come back to in a minute, we hear that there are different gradations of those who are approaching God. There are different levels. They have different understandings of God. So we're now in 16 through 19. In this section, Krishna describes how one can experience God in everyday things that are not abstract. And in this case, he's equating himself with the father, the mother, the grandfather, the object of knowledge, the syllable Om, the Rig Sama Atharva and the Rig Sama Atharva and Yajur Vedas. He's identifying himself with these things, which are a part of everyday life, at least for some people. These are part of everyday life. And in the previous verse, he also identified himself as the ritual, the sacrifice, the offering to the ancestors, the healing herb, the transcendental chant, the butter, the fire, and the offering. The interesting thing about Krishna is, whatever it is, it's coming from Krishna, whatever it is. And that's why it's sometimes bewildering when the Vedas speak about God in absolutely opposite or contradictory language. And what's interesting about Krishna is whatever you can say about Krishna, you can turn around and say the opposite thing, and it's also true. And so common in the Vedas are statements like, he walks but he does not walk. He is very near, yet he's very far away. Everything comes from him, yet he is aloof from everything. That he has no arms and legs, yet he has arms and legs. So we hear all these contradictory statements. And if we were talking about anybody else, this would be utter high nonsense. But the fact that we're talking about the Supreme Lord, there is a sense in which contradictory things are true about him, because everything comes from him. So therefore, hot comes from him, cold comes from him, up comes from him, down comes from him, distance comes from him, nearness comes from him. Piety and religion come from him, as well as the possibility for evil and wickedness. They also come from him. The heavenly worlds come from him. The hellish worlds come from him. Everything comes from him. So whatever you can say, it comes from God. Therefore, God is the most complex subject in the universe, because anything you can name is somewhere down the pipeline connected to Krishna. So one time, I believe it was poet Allen Ginsberg, he asked Prabhupada, well, what about music and poetry? What about that? And Prabhupada said, it should be done for Krishna. And Allen Ginsberg said, only Krishna? And Prabhupada said, well, what isn't Krishna? So it's like, essentially everything is connected to Krishna. Of course, one can do music, poetry, drama, artwork, and everything like that in a way as to make us forget about Krishna. That's one thing. But one can also do all those same things in a way that reminds us of our connection with Krishna. So everything is in some way connected with Krishna. And for those who have trouble grasping the concept of God, for those people, these kind of verses are there, and they help us to come in contact with the Supreme Lord through things that we can easily experience, to things that are not intangibles, to things that are not abstractions, things that are a part of the everyday world. Now, this is just one segment where Krishna talks like this. Actually, there's a few others. In chapter 7, verses 8 to 11, he also speaks in a similar way. And in chapter 10, verses 19 through 24, he again speaks in a similar way, where he equates himself with everyday things. In some places he says he's water. Some places he says he is the ability in man. In some places he says he's sex life, which is not contrary to religious principles. So he says these things, and we can understand that through this experience, through this very tangible experience, we can begin to try to once again reconnect with that person who has been deliberately hidden by this universe, the universe that he designed. So Krishna designs the universe to hide him, and we want it that way. But at some point when we discover that's a problem, wanting to hide from Krishna, and we want to once again see him, then Krishna arranges that we can begin to see him again. And the way he does that is through letting us see some cracks in the covering potency of the material world, where we can begin to sense his actual reality, even though we don't see it. And to see Krishna face to face is a very rare experience that happens only for those, generally speaking, who are very advanced in spiritual life. Those who are very advanced in spiritual life can meet Krishna face to face. And indeed, that is the whole purpose of life, to come to the stage where one can meet the Supreme Lord face to face, even in this body, even before death. But of course, it happens to few before death. Most often, if one is very advanced, one may, at death at least, be able to reconnect with the Supreme Lord. But for some, it can happen even before it. So the people of this world are also emanations from Krishna, but we do not say that everybody is God. That's what we call Mayavad philosophy. We are equal to God in the sense that we come from God, or we sometimes say that we are equal to God in quality, but we are not equal to God in quantity. So just as the hand is part of the body, it's undeniable that the hand is part of the body, but the hand is not the whole body. The hand is just a part of the body. The spark that flies out of a bonfire at night, the spark is a part of the fire, but the spark is not the whole fire. The drop that comes from the ocean is a part of the ocean, but it's only a part of the ocean. It has the same chemical properties as the ocean, but you cannot float a battleship in a drop of water, but you can float one in the ocean. So in this way, we have some qualities that are identical with the qualities of the Supreme Lord, and yet there's some categories in which we are very fundamentally different than the Supreme Lord. He is always the whole and includes all of us, but we are not the whole, nor do we include him or even each other. We are individual and eternally fragmental parts of the Supreme, like an atom of consciousness. So this atom of consciousness is individual to us, and I experience the senses that come through my particular eyes and nose, ears, and mouth. I know the pains that this body is undergoing, but I do not have any idea what you're seeing and what pains are going on in your body. I have no experience of that. However, Krishna has experience of all bodies, and this is described in chapter 13. But Krishna is the knower in all bodies, but we are only the knower in one body. And so therefore, we are called the Tatastha Shakti, technically. So we have the Bahiranga Shakti, the Antaranga Shakti, and the Tatastha Shakti. These are three separate energies of the Supreme Lord. They are all emanations for Krishna. So the Antaranga Shakti is Krishna's internal energy. It's Krishna, it's all of Krishna's avatars and expansions, and it is the spiritual world. This is all internal energy of the Supreme. on the other side of the coin, we have what's called his Bahiranga Shakti, or his external energy. And the external energy is matter. That very stuff that we were talking about a minute ago that is designed to hide God, it's called matter. And so not only is it the stuff that we move around, eat, sleep, walk on, smell, drive through, manipulate, manufacture, buy, sell, etc., etc. Not is this the thing that we do all this stuff with, but it has also got the property where it hides Krishna. So we call it matter, but it's also known in Vedic terminology as Bahiranga Shakti, the external energy. So it hides Krishna among doing all those other things. So in between the external and the internal energies, there's a middle Shakti, or a middle energy, and that energy is called the Tatastha Shakti, and that's you and me. We are not matter, but we are not fully Krishna either. And we are like a small satellite republic in between two superpowers. You know, we can unite with either one. We can become interested in the Supreme and partake in our spiritual energy, or we can reject the Supreme and become completely bamboozled by matter. So we can do either one. And not only that, we can change which one we do from second to second, and most of us do. You know, we some few minutes we're involved in spiritual life, then we forget about everything and we get right back into you know, manipulating material energy and trying to enjoy its various flavors, colors, shapes, forms, and various types of manifestations that we find particularly attractive as the 21st century makes them available to us in interesting configurations, like iPhones and you know, drones and various automobiles of all sorts, and internet, you know, videos and all kinds of things. All this becomes available to us, and we can become completely lost in it. So we are in between two major energies, the internal and external energy, and at each moment we can decide which way to turn our attention. That's what it means to have free will. That's what it means to have free will. At any moment we can turn our attention to either side, to the external or internal energy. And therefore, sometimes the entire arrangement is described like the beach. You have where the land is, and that's dry, and you have where the ocean is, where that's wet. And in between the ocean and the land, there's this area called the beach, where sometimes in high tide, the ocean comes in and overwhelms a certain area of land, and other times at low tide, the ocean recedes, and that same period, or that same section of territory becomes dry again. So in a similar fashion, sometimes we are overruled by the material energy, and we are completely under the sway, the hypnotic sway of the material energy, and other times we are covered from the hypnotism of the material energy, and we can actually see our connection with the Supreme. So the process of devotional service is to try to labor to engage in a process which keeps us on dry land most of the time and not overwhelmed by Krishna's throwing and covering potency. You know, so we have the avaranatmika and the prakshipatmika potency, where the material illusory energy captivates us and then keeps us submerged under illusion. So if you want illusion, it's easy to have. The whole world, that's the default mode. Most people have no idea that they're under illusion from the moment they come out of the womb till the last breath they take in a hospital bed. The whole of their lives, they were just living one illusion after another, and their entire lifetime never accomplished anything significant, because whatever they did accomplish will be erased by death. And they will be in a new body soon. And that new body will lay no claim to whatever they accomplished in this lifetime. So if we were a king or a president, if we had millions of dollars, or we were well known, or a great poet, or a impressive statesman, or we were, a business magnate, or we had some discovery and we had won several Nobel Prizes, all that means nothing when we become transported to a new body. So when we become transported to a new body, we have no claim over any of that we had in the last incarnation. And now we're in a new place, in a new body, in a new form, and we don't even remember, for the most part, that we were ever part of some other arrangement. So whatever we accomplish in this body will be lost to time. And therefore, why labor? Why make that the focus of one's life when it's actually going to make no difference in the long run? Rather, one should try to labor for something which will not be lost with the death of the body, and that is the knowledge of who we really are, that we are not this body, and that we are servant of the Supreme. And if we try to do that, like the shore part of the beach, like the dry land, we will stay out of the water of illusion, and we will be able to see Krishna more and more, not just as an interesting idea, not just as an abstraction, not just as a synonym for the universe or some such thing, but actually as a being, and a being that is the source of everything, and a being whose relationship is actually the whole goal of everything in the universe. So here in these verses, 11 through 16, I believe it is, that we learn about these particular, 16 through 19, that's what I'm trying to say, 16 through 19, we hear about how Krishna describes himself in terms of physical, more tangible things. And then after that, from 20 to 29, mostly we're going to hear about demigod worship, how Krishna feels about it. And he says flatly that demigod worship is of no real importance, that those who worship him in that way do so, but they do it in a wrong way. That actually when someone worships a demigod, they're really worshiping Krishna, who's the supreme God, but they're doing so in an indirect and an incorrect way. So better just worship the Supreme Lord. So that's what we're going to hear in verse 20 to 29, and from 30 to 34, then we start to learn about people who have some problem. What about those who start off in devotional life, but they have some problem? They backslide or something. So we learn about that at the end of this 9th chapter, this chapter entitled The Most Confidential Knowledge. So spiritual life is based on our conception of God. We may have a very well philosophically developed understanding of God because we have heard from authorities, or we may have our own concocted version of what we think God is, or we may not even believe in God at all. So in this chapter, back in verse 15, all these situations are described. And at the top are the devotees. We talked about this yesterday morning, that the devotees, they understand God to be a person. They understand that service to him is the purpose of life. They understand that they're laboring to get out from the illusion of the material world. They understand these things, and therefore they're constantly engaged in serving and chanting. So that's the highest, the Mahatmas, as it's called. Then beneath them are the Sukratinas, as they're described. And the Sukratinas are those people who don't have a clear conception of God yet and are not really sure what their relationship is with God. And they more or less see God as their order supplier. And therefore their relationship with God is one of doing some ritual and expecting God to reciprocate with that ritual by bestowing some blessing on them, some material benediction, basically. So those are called the Sukratinas, and there's 4 of them. They were described in chapter 7. I won't get into detail there. And beneath them are 3 others, which are known as the Ekatvena, the Bahuda, Pritakvena Bahuda, and finally the Vishvatamuk. And so the Ekatvena is the monist, or the impersonalist, the person who thinks that he is God and there's no difference, that we are God, end of story. We are God completely, and etc., etc. This is the Ekatvena. And such a person imagines that one day they will come out of their illusion of being separate from God and actually understand how they, in fact, are God. So that's the Ekatvena. The Pritakvena Bahuda, Prabhupada describes in 9.15 that such a person either worships many gods, thinking that they're all equal or equivalent, or such a person makes some imaginary god and worships that. And then finally at the bottom we have the Vishvatamukam. Such people think of the universe as God. That's their whole conception. God is the universe is God. We also call that pantheism. So these are people who at least have some fundamental connection with God. Then when you drop below that, you get into people who are agnostic and atheist, people who have no conception of God or are committed to the idea that there is no such thing as God. So these are various views of the Supreme, and depending on someone's clarity of vision and their connection with authoritative knowledge, they will be somewhere on this spectrum. So I'm going to stop there. And if there are any questions or statements, anybody have anything that they would that they were confused about or whatever, or would like to know something more about?
Namaste, Maharaj.
Yeah, Hare Krishna.
You talked about Krishna saying that demigod worship was not the most correct thing to do. Yet there they are, 2 demigods on the altar.
They're not demigods.
They certainly seem that way to you. I'm still mistaken about this whole thing.
Right.
And many that approach me, or I have approached you, they're mistaken about that as well. So if you could just clarify
Okay.
on that.
So it's described in the Vedic literatures that unlike the modern conception that the universe runs only by mathematical laws and nothing more, the universe is indeed governed by various mathematical laws, but at the same time there are beings who are at the controls, and those beings we call demigods. And the Vedic literatures tell us there's something like 33 million of them. So there's a lot of them. And they handle the details of how the universe operates, how we get our everyday, necessities of life. They're in charge of the rain, the sun, the health that we have, and so many other things. And also, they're in charge of the whole process we know of as karma. But they are like you and me. They are small living entities. However, they are small living entities who've been given a very responsible position in universal management. So they have great mystic power. They have control over some aspect of the universe that we live in, and therefore we call them demi-half gods. They are not God in full. They are a portion of God. So the Supreme is not just one of them. He is actually the source of everything. So he existed before they did. And in Bhagavad Gita we have Aham Adir Hi Devanam. Krishna is saying in Bhagavad Gita that I am the source of the demigods. So their power comes from him. And indeed they are tiny fragments like you and me, and they come from Krishna, but they are not on any kind of equal footing with Krishna. And in India, basically many people worship demigods. And as we were saying, this condition or this particular way of relating to the Supreme is called Pritak Vena Bahuda in 9.15. So this is described in Vedic literature, but it's described under the heading of a process that we call Pravrti Marg. So Pravrti Marg is the process where one performs various Vedic rituals with the express purpose of gaining some material advantage in the future, and that whole thing is called Pravrti Marg. And something like 97% of the Vedic literatures describe that process. But the process of Bhakti Yoga, which is actually Nivriti Marg, has nothing to do with this understanding and has no objective similar to that. In fact, Bhakti Yoga or Nivriti Marg is called the path of renunciation, and instead we are not trying to garner for ourselves some type of material benediction or advantage by worshiping various demigods. Instead, we are just trying to please the Supreme Lord, end of story. We don't care whether he reciprocates with us or not. Why do we serve God? Because that's what there really is to do in the universe. And so who you see on the altar there are not demigods. That's Lord Chaitanya and Lord Nityananda. They came to this material world some 500 years, 550 years ago. And Chaitanya was a direct expansion of Krishna. So he's sometimes said to be directly Krishna. Moreover, it's said that Chaitanya is Radha and Krishna in one body. So he's not a demigod, he's directly God. And Nityananda is a direct expansion of Krishna's brother, Balaram, who's another expansion of Krishna. So Krishna expands like a kaleidoscope in a number of different expansions, but each of these expansions are equally powerful with him. So therefore, in Vedic terminology, we call these either kalas or amsas, or in more Western terminology, we call them sometimes limbs, or sometimes we call them Vishnu Tattva, which means that they have the same potency as Krishna, but they just happen to be in a different form, maybe with a little different mood, and they perform different pastimes. So Krishna is the original candle. He's the one that expands everything, so therefore he's called the Avatari, and all other expansions of him are called avatars. And each one of them have the same potency as Krishna. And all of these are called either amsas or kalas. So an expansion of an expansion is sometimes called a kala. But still, an expansion of an expansion still has the same potency as the Supreme. And they are all, as we were saying a minute ago, part of this Antaranga Shakti. But you and I are not. We are Vibhinamsas, particle expansions, and therefore we are tiny expansions, and we do not have the same potency as the Supreme Lord. We have the same qualities as the Supreme Lord, but we don't have the same potencies. And the demigods as well are in the same category as we, but they have more power than we do. So in a book called The Nectar of Devotion, Rupa Goswami lists 64 qualities, 64 principal qualities that God has. And when we talk about Krishna, he has all 64, %. Even other Vishnu expansions only have 60 of the 64 qualities that Krishna himself possesses. The demigods, on the other hand, they may have 55 of the 64 qualities, but they don't have them in full the way that Krishna has them. They have them only to a smaller proportion. And then you and I, as human beings, we only have 50 of the 64 qualities that Krishna possesses, but we have them in minute proportion. So in this way, we can kind of get a sense of where the difference lies here. So Shiva, Ganesh, Surya, Lakshmi, Brahma, all these various demigods, they have an important duty to perform in the material management of the universe, but they are not on the same footing or level with the Supreme. They cannot independently create, nor does their power reside within themselves. The Supreme Lord is self-created. The Supreme Lord is self-empowered. The Supreme Lord's own energies can do anything, and no one is equal to or greater than him. So in this way, the demigods are different. Although one can worship them, one is worshiping them usually within the framework of what we said was the Pravrti Marg system. You can do that, but Krishna describes that this is less intelligent, that you're wasting your time. Even if you manage to get the benediction of going to the heavenly planets, it's of no real value because eventually you'll have to come out of the heavenly planets. You can't stay there forever. However, if instead you try to understand the Supreme Lord and serve him under the rules of Nivriti Marg, then you can be released from the cycle of birth and death. You go beyond the heavenly planets to the spiritual world proper, where you can stay forever. And that's where all the incarnations of the Supreme live. And there are no demigods. There's no need for them. The Supreme Lord directly organizes everything in the spiritual world. So maybe this kind of helps you understand how these different categories work together. They may appear like demigods because they are what we call murtis, or forms. But we are not worshiping someone who is not supreme. We're worshiping the actual Supreme. And in the Vedic literatures, it describes this. The Srimad Bhagavatam goes through a lot of elaborate explanation to give us this distinction between what a demigod is and who the Supreme Personality of Godhead is. Although in the material world, people certainly do worship both. But those who worship demigods, as Krishna says in chapter 7 and in chapter 9, and even in chapter 2, he makes the same statements, that in chapter 2 he says those who worship the demigods are, Vedavata Rata, the flowery words of the Vedas they follow. In chapter 7 he says that when someone wants to worship a demigod, I make his faith steady in that demigod, and in this way they worship me, but they do so in a wrong way. And then in chapter 9 again we're going to hear that worship of the demigods is done, but it is not actually the right path, So if one is still materially committed to wanting material happiness, then worshiping the demigods is attractive to that individual. But when we finally recognize that that's useless, then we turn our attention to the Supreme only, and we don't need to connect with the demigods. Although we don't disrespect them, nor do we suggest that they don't exist. So we don't go that far, but we don't target them as the objects of our devotion. That's all. Other questions? Yes.
Yes.
Oh, you had another question. Yeah, go ahead.
I'm sorry, I'll let you go after this. One more clarification.
Yeah.
If you seek their intercession on your behalf, is that still I don't say the same as, but working towards total devotion to the Supreme?
Say that again. I couldn't understand it.
If you seek a demigod's intercession to the Supreme on your behalf, is that still not? Obviously, it's not total devotion to the Supreme. But is it along the way?
Actually, it's considered devotion. That the gopis did that. They prayed to Katyayani so that they could get Krishna as their husband. So here, the gopis are praying to a demigod to help them get close to Krishna. That's considered devotion. But generally, there's no need to do that. One can directly try to approach the Supreme and ask the Supreme to help us to get closer to the Supreme. So if one approaches demigods in the attitude that the demigods are servants of the Supreme, which they are, then in that case one is doing the right thing. One has the right attitude. approaching demigods individually separate from the Supreme Lord is something like trying to get bribes from people in government. You know, you have the president or the main manager or whatever it happens to be, the CEO or whatever. And if you separately seek out his department heads and try to get them to cut you a deal, then that's considered bribery and it's not correct. But if you work through them to serve the Supreme, then there's nothing wrong with that. That's actually the way it should be done, you know. So, but here with the Supreme Lord, there's no express need to divert oneself through a demigod to reach the Supreme, although it can be done. It's not wrong, but it's better just to keep things simple and go directly to the Supreme. Okay. I think somebody else had a question back there. Yeah.
Yeah, it has been said that knowingly or unknowingly, willingly or unwillingly, all of us, small individuals,
Right.
will ultimate goal is to go towards the Supreme.
Right.
When, I mean, this process would continue forever.
Say that again.
Would this process be continued forever for everybody?
Well, I'll say something. You could tell me whether this is the question that you have. That what goes on is an ever-increasing deepening of our connection with the Supreme Lord. But before we get to that, we have to get to this point where we're finally aware that that's the real goal of life. That's a whole different quest. So for most people reincarnating in the material universe over and over again, we're not sure that's really the goal of life. We have many other possible goals. So maybe we think we should merge with God. Maybe we think that we should become famous or rich, or we should become powerful or knowledgeable, or we should win the Olympics or something like that. Maybe those are our goals. But at some point, after all these different trials of different kinds of things, we kind of give up on these other goals because we see there's no real juice in them. Then we come to understand God. But now that we've come to understand God, that's not the end of the story. As I tell people, at some point it dawns on everybody, wherever they are, maybe in this lifetime or 100 lifetimes down the road, it dawns on them that this material world just isn't right. It never was and never will be. Material happiness never works. Although the billboards are there, it never works out. I've got to find another game. And then when they realize that that game is to reconnect with the Supreme, then suddenly we think, yeah, that's the right thing. But at the same moment, we realize how addicted we are to still playing the other game. And so then we have to go through all the struggle of rehab, of changing the way we think, changing the way we act, and gradually bringing ourselves. So then after we've finally understood what the real goal is, then we have to actually bring our entire self to that goal through the process of bhakti. And then once we get high up in the focus of bhakti, then even still the mystery of the Supreme becomes more and more deep, and we begin to understand that our relationship with the Supreme is far more intricate than we imagined it ever could be, So you've got those kind of three different sort of stages, I would say. And maybe that responds to your question, I don't know. Okay. Yeah.
Maharaj. My question is your Krishna is telling not to worship the demigod and worship to
right.
himself. We had seen in the Ramayana, when Rama was going to the Lanka,
right.
He is praying to the Sivlinga.
To the what?
Sivlinga, like Shiva.
Shiva, right.
Yeah.
Right.
So my question is that, if he is telling everybody to pray himself directly, not to the god, then what that demonstrates he is worshipping the Shiva?
Well, in the Vedic literatures we have two systems, as we mentioned before, Pravrti Marg and Nivriti Marg. And in chapter 5 of first canto of Srimad Bhagavatam, we have the story that Vedavyas has written the 4 Vedas, the Rig, Sama, Atharva, Yajurveda that we just heard about here. He's written their expansions, you know, the Brahmanas, the Aranyakas, and the Upanishads, and the Agamas, and all these other things. And he's even written the Itihasas, like the Srimad Mahabharata, you know, so he's written all these things. But he still feels something's missing. Something's missing. And he comes to the conclusion himself that what's missing is that he's described the path of yoga, he's described the path of Tyaga, of renunciation, he's described the path of karma kanda, he's described the path of various other Vedic systems, charity, penance, austerities, all these kinds of things. But he's also described bhakti, but he's mixed them all in as if they're equal. And so he feels that his fault was that he didn't give specific focus on bhakti. So when he's thinking like this, his spiritual master, Narada Muni, appears to him, and Narada Muni tells him, yes, you certainly have made a serious error. That people will read the Vedic literature and they will come to the conclusion that good wife, progeny, elevation to heavenly planets is really the goal of Vedic knowledge, and you and I know that's not true. So what you've done is a disservice by writing all this. So at that point in time, Vedavyas decides to write a final literature, and that literature is Srimad Bhagavatam. And in Srimad Bhagavatam, it does not at all eulogize any of these other systems. It gets right to the point of Bhakti Yoga. There's no explanation in there of why one should engage in karma kanda, why one should do yoga practice. There's no involvement in the Srimad Bhagavatam and why one should engage in various austerities or try to merge with God. These things are not discussed at all. But then we can back up and ask the question, well, if that's true, why in the hell is this other stuff there, you know? And the answer is also simple. The answer is that some people are just not ready for bhakti. They don't want it. They're still convinced that the big apple of material happiness is out there somewhere. One day I'm gonna get it, you know? And as long as we're convinced that material happiness is real and we can get it, devotional service will never happen in our lives. You know, we will always think, yes, nice idea, great, but I've got some business to do. I've got to get busy. I've got to get cracking. I'm going to, you know, make my way to the big apple of material happiness, you know. But so for them, better than living a life of a wanton sense enjoyer, where we do whatever it takes to climb to the top of the heap and to enjoy material happiness, we do it at least in a pious way. So for them, for such people, we have the whole Pravarti Marg system. For people who just, when they hear about the idea of renunciation, of engaging in devotional service, it just scares the boots off them, and they would rather do something else. So here is something that doesn't scare the boots off them. They can think, oh, okay, this I can relate to. I can perform these various sacrifices to, you know, Ganesh, or to, you know, usually the goddess of choice is Durga Devi, you know, Dehi, 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 at least for Bengalis. They have all these litanies that they do so that Goddess Durga gives them, you know, a good wife, prosperous, you know, family life, a business, or their crops go well, you know, et cetera, et cetera. So in this way, one is really focused on the material world, but at least one is doing it in a somewhat organized and civilized way. So that's the reason why this other stuff is there. And so Ramachandra, as a expansion of the Supreme, he also indicated this, that if someone's not ready for actual service and full-on devotion, then one should at least do this much, go that direction. So that's why it isn't completely gone. Yet, some people have argued, Bhaktivinoda Thakur said one time famously that if the entire Vedic library burned forever, gone from the earth, like the library in Alexandria was burned by the Romans, but Srimad Bhagavatam alone remained, nothing would be lost. So we know that we have the cream of Vedic literature, the Srimad Bhagavatam, but for those who just really aren't after the cream yet, we've got the rest of it there. So it creates an organized society that's at least not degenerate, and therefore it's kind of a little bit better than just people going for whatever. And so for this reason, sometimes we see that the gopis, they worship Katyayani. We see that Maharaj, not Maharaj, was it Nanda? He went to offer respects to Lord Shiva at one time, So we have these kind of things that even in Krishna's pastimes, people appear to worship the demigods. But ultimately we understand that the real deal is to worship the Supreme. That's the highest thing. And that subsums and it eliminates the necessity for anything else. Other questions? Yeah, Murli.
Quick comment first. As you say, the Bhagavatam cuts to the chase, which says very clearly, even if you want material things, then you just worship them.
Right.
My question is this: you were saying that in order to really understand Krishna, you have to engage in devotional service.
Right.
So we know that reading about Krishna or saying Krishna's name, that's devotional service.
Right.
Yet we see there are scholars who have read a lot about Krishna,
right,
who teach and therefore speak Krishna's name all the time, but they don't really understand Krishna. So it appears that there's some quality or something missing,
right,
even though there are apparently, so maybe you could explain why they...
What's missing is the parampara. One has to understand about Krishna, not through one's own speculative investigation, but through the parampara system. So therefore, if one learns about Krishna from those who know about Krishna, one will come to the right conclusion. Otherwise, we will inevitably come to some misconstrued conclusion and have many fallacial understandings. And unfortunately, the more we study on our own, outside of the structure of the devotees of the Supreme, the more we will be convinced we know what we're talking about when we're actually way off base. So I'm going to catch a train back down to New York City. So thank you all very much for your kind attention. All glories to Srimad Bhagavatam and